Tonight, the wake for murdered NYPD officer Brian Moore taking place on Long Island today. We'll have a live report from the scene. And a bit later, we take a look at crime in New York City. The mayor says we're at record levels in terms of crime being low, but at the same time, the police commissioner, Bill Bratton, says things have been this dangerous for cops in decades. Also, the scramble over Skelos. Democrats calling for the head of the Senate Majority Leader. So are some Republicans, but the question is, why are other Republicans trying to still keep him there? Plus, we're going to take a look at Albany and just how bad of a mess we've got going on in our capital district. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. And tonight, we do begin with a very sad story. People gathering in Bethpage on Long Island for the wake of slain NYPD officer Brian Moore. The 25-year-old was shot while patrolling in Queens on Saturday, and he died in the hospital this Monday. Files One's Kevin Vesey. He is live outside the funeral home with the very latest. Kevin?
Well, Richard, good evening. You know, more than 30,000 police officers from across the United States and Canada are expected to attend the wake and the funeral for police officer Brian Moore, a hero whose life and career were cut way too short. A long line of friends, family, fellow police officers, and public officials lined up to pay their respects to fallen NYPD officer Brian Moore. Among them, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo.
It's a terrible tragedy. It's once again an awful, frightening reminder of the sacrifice that so many men and women in law enforcement make.
Cuomo shared with reporters what he said to Officer Moore's father, a retired NYPD sergeant.
I said to the father, your son must have really loved you. He followed Dad into the business. I know a little bit about that. I followed my father into the business, and there is a sense of love and respect that shows from son to father that is louder than any words.
The 25-year-old police officer lived in Massapequa and graduated from Plain Edge High School, a 5-year veteran of the police force, a job that many officials say is becoming increasingly dangerous.
What's really disheartening is what's going on in this country right now, the anti-cop sentiment, and you wonder if this growing anti-cop sentiment wasn't increasing, would Officer Moore be alive today?
It's truly a frightening time for our country and for our city and for our state.
And New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio is also expected to make an appearance tonight. That second viewing starts at 7 o'clock. Reporting for RFL, I'm Kevin Vesey.
All right, Kevin, thank you very much. And I'll remind it again in a second, but we will be covering on Fios One the funeral tomorrow from Long Island. I want to bring in our panel right now. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Republican strategist Bill O'Reilly and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. And Richard Bross will be joining us a little bit later in the program. Dom, unfortunately, you've covered too many of these. And it's always moving, the turnout from police from points east, west, north, south, wherever it may be, the turnout. But my God, what a life snuffed out too soon. 25 years old, decorated cop given his young age, father, it was a family business, if you will, and just the senseless tragedy that it was, just doing his job. It really sad story.
Richard, I'm glad you said it. As a journalist, you never get used to covering these types of funerals. You consider the life when you're on location. It's very emotional, it's a sea of blue, and it's a positive thing where police are supporting their own and thus supporting us because they're really a reflection of the community. But the heartbreaking part is when you look at the wife or the mother or the retired cop, father in this case, when you look at the family members. It is extremely tough as a journalist to cover these types of situations because it's very, very emotional and it touches everyone that's there. And to your point, you're 1,000% correct. A young man is 25 years old. 25 years old. Living his life on Long Island, doing all the right things, and it's over because he tried to protect us.
And you know, Bill, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You heard that soundbite from one of the officers who attended and talked about the climate that we're in right now. I know Dominic will be at the funeral tomorrow, and I know you have an interview with Pat Lynch, the head of the PBA, who I'm sure will talk about this. Unlike the tragedy earlier this year where officers Liang and Ramos were killed, they were targeted for being officers. Right now we have no evidence that the thug who shot him was doing anything other than reacting to the scene playing out. However, there's a lot of tension right now. There's national tension over what's happened in Baltimore, what's happened in Missouri, what's happened on Staten Island, what's happened in South Carolina. I can keep going here, the different date lines, but yet police feel that they're being targeted at the same end, both with anti-cop sentiment and even targeted. This is the 5th shooting in just the last 5 months of NYPD officers. You have competing tensions simultaneously.
Yeah, it's a legitimate question. It's one that has to get asked, and I'm sure there's going to be a very long conversation about this. Does it become easier for someone to pull a trigger against a cop when that anger is out there and when the discussion is out there? I mean, you have so many rallies going on, and I'm not saying that there haven't been terrible things that have happened on the other side. If you look in the Carolinas, that situation. But does it become easier for someone to pull the trigger when they may not have, when they're saying those cops, you know, and just labeling individuals as those cops?
You know, Andrew, it's in the course of a week, we'll be talking about the needs for major reform here, who should investigate, who should police the police, and all those other questions. Then simultaneously you see this situation, and then you wonder if the dialogue's been ratcheted up too much. Unfortunately, these have to be simultaneous debates that we have right now, and you can't avoid either one, but navigating it with the sensitivities, it's getting tougher and tougher.
It is. It is. I don't want to take any. Obviously, anytime there's a loss, especially for a police officer or a soldier or somebody who's dedicated their lives to protecting our community, it affects us all, and it should affect us all. There are equally compelling concerns about police actions across the country, and those concerns deserve to be fully voiced. And tragedies like this one need to be noted, and we need to handle it with sensitivity. But my hope is that it doesn't distract us from the conversation about the larger problems that we have had across the country when it comes to issues with communities and police.
And tomorrow, obviously, the primary focus will be remembering the service of Officer Moore. But we're going to have a wide-ranging debate and conversation here tomorrow night on this very subject. As mentioned, Dominic will be talking to the head of the PBA, Pat Lynch. If you remember, Pat Lynch, after the shootings of both officers Ramos and Liang, said that Mayor de Blasio had blood on his hands. He hasn't used the same rhetoric or temperature after this shooting, but nonetheless, it's a very interesting conversation that Dominic will have tomorrow in Long Island with the man on your screen. Also, we'll be joined by a high-ranking officer, the highest-ranking African-American officer at one time in New York City here, Philip Banks, recently retired NYPD chief of department, and he left because he couldn't, quote, bridge the gap with Commissioner Bratton. He too, from a long generation of law enforcement, and he has had his issues. So navigating both the loss of one of his own in the line of duty, but also some of the systemic problems right now of policing communities of color, that conversation will also take place that Andrew will have tomorrow. Plus, obviously, we'll be covering and talking to some of the people coming in and out of that funeral, in addition to carrying that funeral live early in the day tomorrow. Okay. When we come back, we will pivot from this tragedy to what can only be described as the drama over Albany and over whether or not Dean Skelos should stay or go. That question even dividing members of Skelos' own party. And a person sitting on our table right now made some news with an editorial that many of you may have read today on this very subject. We'll get into that and more after this.